On Easter Sunday 1722, a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen sailed toward a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and saw something that made no sense. Rising from the coastline were enormous stone figures, some of them nearly 30 feet tall, weighing dozens of tons, staring inland with their backs to the sea, hundreds of them, built by human hands on an island so remote it took weeks of open ocean sailing to reach from the nearest land. And around those figures, almost nothing, no trees, barely any vegetation, a landscape that looked like it had been scraped clean. The people he found there were thin, living in caves and crude shelters, farming rocky soil that could barely support them. There were maybe 3,000 of them left. What Roggeveen could not have known, standing on the deck of his ship, looking at those stone giants, was that he was looking at the aftermath of one of the most complete societal collapses in human history, and that the island he was staring at was about to become the most studied, most argued over, and most misunderstood example of what happens when a civilization runs out of the resources that built it. The story most people know goes like this. A thriving civilization built extraordinary monuments until they destroyed their own environment to do it, cut down every tree on the island, collapsed under the weight of their own excess, and killed each other off in the chaos that followed. A perfect parable of human self-destruction, tidy, morally obvious, and according to some of the most recent and most rigorous archaeology done on the island, probably not entirely accurate. The real story is stranger, more contested, and considerably more disturbing than the version that gets repeated. Because the version that gets repeated lets you keep a comfortable distance. The real version does not. The island the Dutch called Easter Island, and which its inhabitants called Rapa Nui, was first settled by Polynesian navigators somewhere between 1200 and 1300 CE. These were not lost sailors stumbling onto an accidental landfall. Polynesian navigation was among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, using stars, ocean swells, bird migration patterns, and cloud formations to cross thousands of miles of open water with deliberate precision. The people who arrived on Rapa Nui came intentionally, with plants, animals, and the knowledge systems of a culture that had already colonized much of the Pacific. What they found was a subtropical island covered in dense palm forest, rich in bird life, with soil capable of supporting agriculture. By the standards of a small Polynesian settlement, it was genuinely abundant. The population grew. Society organized itself into clans, each controlling a portion of the island's coastline, and sometime in the 14th or 15th century, they began building the moai. The moai are the stone figures Roggeveen saw from his ship. Nearly 1,000 of them have been documented, carved from the volcanic rock of a single quarry called Rano Raraku in the island's interior. The largest ever completed stands over 30 feet tall and weighs more than 80 tons. Several were never finished, still embedded in the quarry rock, as if work stopped suddenly in the middle of a cut. For decades, the central mystery was how they were moved. The island had no large animals, no wheels, and the figures needed to travel miles from the quarry to their coastal platforms. Experimental archaeology has since demonstrated that the moai could have been walked upright using ropes and coordinated human effort, rocking them side to side in a movement that left traces in the soil consistent with what excavation actually finds. The how, it turns out, was not the interesting question. The interesting question was why, and the answer to that question is what explains everything that came after. The moai were not decorations. They were not monuments to vanity in the way the parable version of the story implies. They were representations of ancestral chiefs, believed to channel the spiritual power of the dead into the living community through their eyes, which were inlaid with white coral and red stone when the figures were erected on their platforms. Each clan built moai to demonstrate and concentrate the mana, the spiritual authority of their lineage. The more impressive your moai, the more powerful your ancestors, the more legitimate your claim to land and resources. This meant that moai construction was not a choice any individual clan could opt out of. If your neighbor clan was building taller and more impressive figures, and those figures represented supernatural authority over territory, you had to compete. The construction was not a single leader's vanity project. It was a structural feature of how power was organized on the island. It was built into the logic of the society itself, and it required wood, enormous quantities of wood for the sledges, ropes, rollers, and levers used to transport and erect the figures, wood that came from the island's palm forest. Here is where the story becomes contested in ways most popular accounts ignore. The traditional narrative places the blame for deforestation squarely on the islanders themselves, framing it as a cautionary tale of short-sighted resource consumption. But in the early 2000s, archaeologist Terry Hunt of the University of Hawaii published research that complicated this picture significantly. Hunt's excavations found that the Polynesian rat, which arrived on the island with the first settlers, reproduced rapidly in an environment with no natural predators and fed heavily on palm seeds, the primary mechanism by which the palm forest regenerated itself. Hunt's argument was that the deforestation of Rapa Nui was not caused solely by human cutting, but by a combination of human use and rat predation on the seed stock that would have allowed the forest to recover. Remove the forest's ability to regenerate and even moderate, human use becomes catastrophic over time. The debate between Hunt's interpretation and more traditional accounts is ongoing in the academic literature, and most current researchers believe the answer involves both factors working together rather than either one alone. But the significance of Hunt's finding is not really about assigning blame, it is about what it reveals regarding the nature of the collapse itself. The people cutting down the trees were not making a single catastrophic decision. They were making thousands of individually rational decisions, each one small enough to seem manageable, in a system that was degrading beneath them at a rate that was invisible from inside the system. By the time the forest was gone, the consequences arrived all at once and from every direction simultaneously. Without trees, the soil eroded. Without soil stability, agricultural yields declined. Without large timber, the islanders could no longer build the ocean-going canoes that had provided a substantial portion of their protein through deep-sea fishing. The island that had once been an abundant resource base contracted, suddenly and severely, into something that could support a fraction of the population that had grown to depend on it. What followed is documented in the archaeological record with grim specificity. The moai on their platforms were toppled deliberately by rival clans. This was not vandalism. Toppling an enemy, clans moai meant destroying their claim to supernatural authority, their legitimacy, their connection to the power that justified their control of land. The obsidian spear points called mata, found in large quantities across the island's surface, date predominantly to the period of collapse. The skeletal remains from this period show evidence of violent trauma. The social structure that had organized the island for centuries dissolved into something that looked, from the archaeological evidence, like sustained interclan warfare over the resources that remained. And then, in 1722, Roggeveen arrived. And 50 years after that, in 1774, James Cook arrived and found the population further reduced. The remaining moai toppled, and the people living in what he described as conditions of poverty and hardship. Within another century, slave raiders from Peru had taken hundreds of the remaining population, and introduced diseases had done the rest. Awar civilization that at its peak may have supported 15,000 people had been reduced to a few hundred survivors living in the ruins of what their ancestors had built. The island that had no outside world to blame, no enemy civilization, no natural disaster, no drought or disease that started the process, had consumed itself from within through a combination of ecological pressure, competitive social dynamics, and the accumulated weight of thousands of individually rational decisions that were collectively catastrophic. Here is the part of the story that nobody who tells it as a simple parable ever quite gets to. The people of Rapa Nui were not stupid. They were not uniquely short-sighted or greedy or self-destructive. They were intelligent, skilled navigators and engineers who built one of the most remarkable monumental traditions in the ancient world, on a tiny island in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. The competitive logic that drove moai construction was not irrational within the system it operated in. The individual decisions that collectively destroyed the forest were not obviously wrong at the moment they were made. The collapse happened not because the people of Rapa Nui were worse than other humans. It happened because they were exactly like other humans, operating rationally within a system whose overall trajectory was invisible from inside it, competing for status and resources using the tools their culture had developed right up until the moment those tools stopped working. There is a version of this story where Rapa Nui is a cautionary tale about a foolish people who did not see what was coming. That version is comfortable because it implies that smarter, more aware people would have done differently. The uncomfortable version, the one the archaeology actually supports, is that the people of Rapa Nui were paying attention. They just could not see the whole island from where they were standing, and neither, for most of human history, could anyone else. The question that the island leaves hanging in the air, the one that Roggeveen could not have articulated standing on his ship in 1722, but that has been articulated many times since, is a simple one. We know we live on an island. We have the satellite images and the atmospheric data and the ecological models. We can see the whole thing from where we are standing. And the question is whether knowing changes anything, whether the view from outside the system is enough to change behavior, that the logic of the system keeps generating from within. Rapa Nui could not answer that question. It was too small, and the people inside it could not see its edges. We do not have that excuse.